What's up, designers, and welcome back to Rempton Games. Today, we learn more than you ever knew you wanted to know about rock, paper, scissors. I want to get this out of the way right away. Unlike my criminally underwatched video on Candyland, this is not a parody. Although rock, paper, scissors is an incredibly simple game, it's also surprisingly deep. And the strategies for rock, paper, scissors have applications far outside of the game. I guarantee that once you know these strategies, you'll start seeing ways to apply them in all sorts of different situations. Without further ado, let's get started. Let's begin with everyone's favorite subject, math. Mathematically, rock, paper, scissors is an incredibly simple game. All three signs are completely identical. They all win, lose, and draw against one of the other signs. Because of this, there's no reason to really favor one sign over another, so the mathematically optimal strategy is simply to pick randomly. This random strategy is what's known as a Nash equilibrium, which basically means it's the optimal way to play if both players are playing perfectly, because there's no way for either player to gain an edge over the other. However, even though this is the mathematically optimal strategy, there are still some problems with it. First, it's boring, and I want this video to be longer than a minute. Second, this strategy can never give you more than a 50% chance of winning, ignoring ties. Since you're here watching an ultimate strategy guide, I imagine you probably want to win a bit more often than that. The final problem is that even if you attempted to use the random strategy, you can't. Humans are notoriously terrible at behaving randomly. Suppose, for example, that you ask someone to pick a number between 1 and 100. If they were really picking randomly, then you would expect each number to come up as often as any other, and in the long run, they should all be picked about the same number of times. However, in practice, that turns out to be not at all true. People tend to pick certain numbers, like 37, far more than numbers like 90, because for some reason, 37 just feels more random, whatever that means. Of course, the number picking thing is really just one example of a much larger trend. Anytime people try to behave randomly, they always inevitably end up falling into predictable patterns. However, this doesn't have to be a bad thing. The thing about a Nash equilibrium is that it really only applies if both players are playing perfectly. But since we know that your opponent won't be using the random strategy, because it's impossible, then we can actually exploit their lack of randomness to give ourselves an edge. Most of the predictive techniques that I cover in this video are going to be psychological, using your opponent's patterns and biases against them. However, before I jump into that, I want to briefly discuss using physical indicators. Is it possible to predict what your opponent is about to play using physical signals and play the winning hand against them? It turns out the answer is yes, if you're a robot. Researchers at the University of Tokyo made a Janken robot, named after the Japanese term for the game of rock, paper, scissors, which is able to react to an opponent's movements and automatically play the proper counter move. The robot is able to recognize and react to an opponent's movements in under a millisecond and is basically unbeatable. For a human player, this strategy is not recommended. But physical signals can still be used as one factor when making a prediction of your opponent's next moves. Players clenching their hand more tightly or tucking their thumb behind their fingers could be preparing to play rock, whereas players that are holding their fist a bit more loosely might be about to play paper. While these indications are subtle, they can be powerful as part of a larger strategy. The majority of your strategy, however, should be built on psychological indicators.
You're trying to trick me into giving away something. It won't work.
It has worked! You've given everything away! I know where the poison is!
For one thing, although all three signs in rock, paper, scissors are mathematically identical, that doesn't mean they don't feel different. The names of the signs, the shapes that your hand makes when throwing a particular sign, and even the order that they're listed in the name of the game can all affect a player's decision to play one sign over another. Let's start with rock. Why? Because it turns out that a disproportionate number of players actually do start with rock.
Good old rock. Nothing beats that.
In fact, it's the most commonly played sign overall, at over 35%, with paper closely behind it and scissors trailing at under 30%. Why would this be? Well, there are probably a few factors. For one thing, most games of rock, paper, scissors begin with a player pumping their fist 3 times, which means that your hand is already gonna be in a rock position. To put it another way, this basically makes throwing rock the default move. Second, is the first sign in the name of the game, which can prime players to throw rock, especially if they're caught off guard and aren't really thinking about it. Throwing rock is actually especially common among male players, probably because it's seen as the most aggressive option. Your hand is in a fist after all. There's also a common belief that players tend to throw rock more often if they get angry or frustrated, although the evidence I've seen for this is mostly anecdotal. All of these factors combined have led to the popularity of the phrase, losers lead with rock. And because paper beats rock, if you're playing against a naive player, opening with paper is your best move.
Poor predictable Bart always takes rock. Rock, paper, dope!
On the other hand, if you think your opponent knows a thing or two, then your best bet is to start with scissors. This is because they probably won't fall into the beginner trap of starting with rock. They might play paper if they think that you're a beginner, but even if they also play scissors, the worst they can do is tie. But what if your opponent knows that you're experienced, so they play rock to counter your scissors? So then your best bet is to play paper to counter their rock. But then what if they expect you to play paper?
So I can clearly not choose the wine in front of me.
Truly, you have a dizzying intellect.
Wait till I get going!
The rabbit hole can get pretty deep. But these two opening moves of starting with paper against a naive player and scissors against a more experienced one should cover most situations. So far, we've been talking about opening moves, but few games of rock, paper, scissors are done in a single throw. Most of the time, you'll be playing best 2 out of 3 or best 3 out of 5, and there'll probably be ties along the way as well. This begs a question. After you've made your opening move, what do you do next? First, one important principle of psychology to keep in mind here is that people are more likely to repeat something that succeeded and not to repeat something that failed, even if success and failure are completely random. This means that if your opponent lost using a particular sign, they're a lot less likely to use that same sign again in the next round. On the other hand, if they beat you using a particular sign, they're way more likely to throw that same sign again. If they do lose and switch, players often switch to the sign that they lost to in the previous round. For example, if your paper covered their rock, in the next turn they're more likely to also throw paper. To counter this, you should switch to the sign that would beat your previous sign, in this case, scissors. On the other hand, if you lost the previous round, you should play the sign that beats your opponent's current hand, under the assumption that they're more likely to play that same sign again. So if your scissors got smashed by their rock, you should switch to paper next round under the assumption that they're more likely to play rock again. Of course, while players like sticking with what works, they don't stick with the same thing too long. In a truly random sequence, long strings of the same term are not uncommon. Take for example these random strings that I generated at numbergenerator.org. Each of these strings has at least one sequence where the same number shows up 5 times in a row. The third sequence actually has 3 of these strings, and in one instance there are 2 strings back to back, which is basically the equivalent of playing paper 5 times in a row, then switching and playing scissors 5 times in a row immediately afterwards. However, while this sort of pattern comes up in a truly random sequence, you'll basically never see someone play this way in an actual game of rock, paper, scissors. Playing the same thing over and over again just doesn't feel random to people, and you'll rarely see someone throw the same sign more than twice in a row. I think this is probably because players don't want to seem predictable by playing the same thing over and over again, so they overcompensate and switch more often than they probably should. Regardless of the reason, once somebody's played the same thing twice in a row, they're far less likely to play the same thing again. In this case, your best bet is to play the sign that loses to the repeated sign. For example, if your opponent just played rock twice in a row, then you should switch to scissors. That way, if your opponent does switch, which they're very likely to do, the worst you can do is tie. For my final strategy tip, while we've been discussing psychological factors that you can use to predict your opponent's next move, it turns out you can actually use reverse psychology to influence your opponent's behavior.
I say to you, don't think about elephants. What are you thinking about?
Elephants.
One way to do this is to announce which sign you're about to throw and actually throw it. In a lot of cases, your opponents aren't going to expect you to follow through on what you said you were going to throw, and therefore are less likely to play the sign that beats what you said you're gonna play. Of course, eventually your opponent is gonna catch on and start expecting you to follow through, in which case you now know exactly what sign they're about to throw. Now, some of you may be thinking that I'm spending way too much time on what is essentially a kid's game used to solve minor disagreements that could easily be resolved with a coin flip. However, that's where I'm gonna have to completely disagree with you. While rock, paper, scissors may be simple, it's this simplicity that actually makes it fundamental. More than probably any other game I've talked about in this series, once you know what to look for, you can actually find examples of rock, paper, scissors strategy all over the place. Take fighting games, for example. Many fighting games contain several different categories of moves, and some of these moves have an inherent advantage against others. This commonly takes the form of a triangle consisting of attacks, grabs, and counterattacks or parries. Normal attacks counter grabs, grabs have an advantage against counterattacks, and counterattacks nullify normal attacks. It could also take the form of neutral, low, and high attacks. You need to predict where your opponent will attack in order to successfully counter them with a jump, duck, or block. Although these games are played in real time, each moment-to-moment decision is basically a miniature game of rock, paper, scissors. So how can we apply our rock, paper, scissors strategies to this situation? First, we have to remember that nobody is truly random. Much like rock is thrown more often than the other signs in rock, paper, scissors, players are naturally going to gravitate towards some options more than others. For example, if someone likes to go for grabs, you know how to punish them with attacks. Players also tend to repeat things that worked and avoid things that don't. This means that if your opponent took out a huge chunk of your health bar with a particular string of attacks, they're probably going to try to do the same thing again, which means you need to be ready to respond with a counterattack. Conditioning is also a huge part of competitive fighting games. When I talked about announcing which sign you're about to throw and then actually following through, that's a simple example of conditioning. You set up a pattern for your opponents, create an expectation, and then use that expectation against them. Let's say that at the beginning of a match, you always follow up a particular attack by attempting to grab. Eventually, your opponent is gonna catch on and begin predicting the grab attempt, which is when you switch it up and punish that prediction. These same ideas can be applied to tons of other games as well, from the elemental type advantages of Pokemon to the weapon triangle found in Fire Emblem. All of these games have an element of rock, paper, scissors in their moment-to-moment gameplay, but some games actually have elements of Rochambeau strategy before the game even starts. Take Magic the Gathering, for instance. While there are many decisions that must be made every turn in a game of Magic the Gathering, a lot of the decisions are actually made outside the game in the process of deck building. While there's a nearly limitless variety of different types of decks that you can make, they're often grouped into three main categories: control, aggro, and mid-range. There's also combo, but that's a whole different beast. To grossly oversimplify, aggro decks go on the offensive and try to win the game as quickly as possible, control decks play defensively and try to win the long game, and mid-range decks are somewhere in between. Aggro decks tend to have an advantage against control-style decks because they can win early in the game before the control deck has time to finish setting up. Mid-range decks take a few turns to get going, but are capable of holding off the aggro decks in the early game and winning later on with superior resources. Finally, because mid-range decks start more slowly than a true aggro deck, this gives the control deck more time to get set up, which gives them an advantage against the mid-range deck in the long term. While the specifics of which deck you play are going to depend on the format you're playing, which cards are currently available, and your personal playstyle and preferences, a big part of the metagame is figuring out what you think other people are going to be playing and determining what you think is going to give yourself an edge against the rest of the field. Now, I could go on listing more examples, but I'd actually like to pass the question off to you. Can you think of any more examples in your own personal lives where rock, paper, scissors strategy could give you an edge? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. That's all I have for today, but if you're interested in gaming strategy, make sure to check out the rest of the videos in this series. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a like and subscribe so you don't miss more game design and strategy content in the future. Until then, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.